Released in 1999 and spread over 4 discs, Koudelka was developed by Saknoth. Saknoth was actually founded in order to produce Koudelka. Hiroki Kikuta, the founder, was originally a composer at Square who worked on games like Secret of Mana and Seiken Densetsu 3. He wanted to produce his own game, but was unable to progress up the corporate ladder at Square, so he decided that he'd just do it himself. Funded by the SNK Corporation, who you might know from franchises like Metal Slug and The King of Fighters, Saknoth hit the ground running in the development of Koudelka. With the intention of creating a horror RPG, Kikuta and his team worked hard on the game. While Kikuta would eventually say he regretted his lack of influence on the game's design, I think that, if nothing else, Koudelka is an interesting game. I have some very fond memories of my time with Koudelka from when I was younger, so it seemed only right that I give it the brief look treatment. One thing that really stood out to me at the time was the fidelity of the game's cutscenes, and given that Saknoth actually used motion capture and real actors, I think this is really impressive for a PlayStation 1 title. Also of note is that the game is fully voiced, and again, they knocked it out of the park with it. Even in the Japanese release, they used English voice acting. This is probably because the game is set near Aberystwyth in Wales. Speaking of the setting, let's set the scene for the story of the game. We're introduced to our main character, the Romani psychic Koudelka Iasant, as she's breaking into Nemeton Manor, losing her pendant in the process. While the CGI here is pretty grainy, I do think that you can really see the benefits that motion capture had for these scenes. Inside the monastery, we also meet Edward Plunkett. He's in fairly bad shape and says he's not quite ready to die yet. He points his gun towards Koudelka, who is cool as a cucumber and gives him some sass. Edward is actually pointing his gun at a monster sneaking up behind Koudelka. She gets thrown to the side and Edward throws his gun over to her. And just like that, we're into combat. Combat in Koudelka is like a light strategy RPG. And personally, I really don't like strategy RPGs at all, so look forward to some brief looks at Final Fantasy Tactics and Fire Emblem games in the future. Our choices are to use an action, move, wait, or check our status. Action choices are to attack with our equipped weapon, use magic, use an item, or change our weapon. Koudelka is a relatively simplistic game by design. Matsuzo Mishida, the art director for the game, said it was designed so that people who don't normally play games could see the endings. And honestly, I respect this kind of approach more than I do the opposite, making games super hard by default with no options to change that. But that's a discussion for a different video. Probably on one of the Souls games, because every gaming channel on YouTube needs to have their video essay on Dark Souls. We do have access to some magic at this point in the game. We have heal and a bunch of fortify stat spells. The fortify stat spells do just that, they buff a stat. In a nice touch, casting fortify stat on an enemy will actually debuff them, and I'm curious to see how useful this will turn out to be later in the game. Future chance here? It's not. RPGs seem to have a tendency to give a player access to a lot of debuff effects that just don't work on bosses, so we'll definitely be trying a few of these out to see if Koudelka also follows the same pattern. Future chance here? It does. After the combat, we decide to go check in on Edward. Thinking that he's about to die, he asks Koudelka, his supposed angel, to pray for him. The ever sassy Koudelka tells Edward there's no bloody way she'll pray for him, and decides to do him a solid by healing his wounds.
I'm not gonna ask you to take me to heaven. But will you pray for me at least?
Are you out of your mind?
Edward seems surprised that he's been healed, but Koudelka just plays it off like it's no biggie. I really like Koudelka's level of sass. She just doesn't care about what people think. Edward appears to have come to the monastery come house after hearing a story while he was in London. Some rich fella bought the monastery and converted it into a house where he's been living at large. The two agreed to work together for the time being. We're now free to explore a bit. The pre-rendered backgrounds still look pretty nice, all things considered. There's just something about this era of gaming that sparks off something pleasant in my head. It's probably just nostalgia, but I do think that Koudelka looks real nice. You'll notice as we walk into the next room, there's a room name displayed at the bottom of the screen with an S. This means this is a save room, but the game hasn't actually explained how to save. Great. I'll figure this out in a bit, but you have to press the menu button while that text is on screen to access the save option. The run button is also on triangle by default. There's some interesting choices in the game that we'll definitely get to later. For now, I equip Eddie here with a knife and we go off to explore a little bit. Now that we have two characters, we have a bit more that we can do in combat. One thing that I do like that may be the saving grace of the combat system for me is that we don't need to decide which way our characters face at the end of a turn. I know why that's an option in a lot of strategy RPGs, but it always just feels like a couple of extra unneeded button presses. Status effects from enemies seem fairly plentiful as you can see, Edward is already poisoned. Cool. In most RPGs, I tend not to use my MP for random encounters as it tends to be quite rare that you can refill it, but in Koudelka you kinda need to. You see, each character has levels for each activity you do in a battle. So since we have Edward equipped with a knife currently, he'll get a bit of knife XP when he attacks. Koudelka will get flare XP for using flare, and so on. We definitely don't want to get to a boss and only have our basic attacks available, so it's pretty important that we level our characters in their preferred method of attack. I'm going to try to build Koudelka out as a caster, and Edward as a physical damage dealer and tank. The eventual third character will be some kind of secondary caster and a buffer. Koudelka levels up from this battle, and we get our last little bit of character customization. Upon leveling up, we get to spend some bonus points in our stats. To avoid explaining too much all at once, I won't go into what all the stats do, but we're mostly going to focus on caster stats on Koudelka and physical stats on Edward. This may be a bad choice, but we'll find out later. The enemy design in this game is also really nice, like this animated table. I do enjoy when games have non-standard enemies in their roster. Sure, have giant cockroaches and all that, but something like an animated table really sings to me. While exploring, we find some bread just lying on a table, and against my better judgment, we decide that we'll just take it with us. I can't imagine that bread is even close to fresh given the state of its surroundings, but we'll take it anyway. It's now time to wander around aimlessly and try to figure out how to actually progress. Every horror game has this, but at least so far, Koudelka doesn't have too wide of an area where we can search. Also, let's just appreciate the tiny little things that represent our pick-upable items. Thankfully, they do stick out a lot compared to the pre-rendered environments, or something like that would get totally lost. The enemy design really is quite nice, and I'll be throwing in some quick clips of each neat new enemy that I find. Like this statue that appears to have had its torso blown open. I will admit the combat itself does play out pretty slowly. I'm also not entirely sure what triggers a combatant being thrown backwards from an attack, but it does sometimes happen. Bumping into these three winged heads did initially have me a little bit worried, but those fears were allayed somewhat when two of them tried to use magic to attack Koudelka and they both did 0 damage. I think this is due to Koudelka's piety stat, which is definitely an approach the developers took to stats. The piety determines resistance to both your opponent's magical attacks and your allies' healing magic. Yes, that's right, if you buffed piety too much, you'll be unhealable. Unfortunately, this stat also governs your maximum MP, so I hope the cap for healing is relatively high, because I'm going to be pumping this stat a fair bit on Koudelka herself. We find a door that is, quote, being held shut by a mystical force, so we turn around and find somewhere else to go. In one of the lower rooms, we're introduced to Ogden and Bessie Hartman, an old couple who are the caretakers of Nemeton Monastery. The only way we actually know this information, funnily enough, is because the game gives us those lines of text before throwing us into a cutscene with the couple. Ogden mentions that it's very rare to have visitors come to this district, and Bessie apologises for only being able to offer soup since they weren't expecting guests. Edward participates with gusto, but Koudelka refuses any. She seems to know something's going on. We find out that Nemeton Monastery was built by an Irish saint named Daniel Scotius, intended to appease monsters and evil spirits. The Hartmans have also been seeing monsters around the monastery starting around 6 months ago. You'd think they'd have fled, but no, they're staying. Ogden does hook us up with some bullets at least. After this little tea party, we're kicked out of the room and the Hartmans lock the door with a red key. Well, at least we know where to go when we inevitably find the red key at least. Do you hear me, future Chaz? You know where this key goes. We slip into the kitchen next, where Koudelka helpfully informs Edward that the soup was poisoned. There's a part of me that thinks that maybe Koudelka let Edward eat the soup in order to keep up the charade that she was oblivious, but there's a bigger part of me that thinks she would just find it funny to see Edward suffer. Just check out the nonchalant way she informs Edward of the poison.
Weren't poisoned, then I would have had some. Got it?
As Edward curls up on the floor in pain, Koudelka offers to find an antidote, provided that Edward doesn't just go and shoot the Hartmans as soon as he's better. Apparently the Hartmans have killed more than a few people. Koudelka curses Edward, and the exploration continues after Koudelka also heals Edward. So much for finding an antidote. While exploring, we find this cool looking suit of armour and actually snag us an L mail. We equip it to Edward and effectively double his health. Very nice. We could have put it on Koudelka, but in theory, Edward should be soaking the vast amount of hits. Eventually, we find this greenhouse room with a passed out man on the floor. Deciding to ignore him, we move towards the back of the room and are ambushed by our first real boss, the evil plant. Because Edward is rocking that ludicrous 600 HP due to a drop, this fight is very easy. We have him move up to the plant and start hacking at it with his knife, while Koudelka hands back and throws flares. It does take a little bit of fighting to go down, and we did heal Edward once out of courtesy, but eventually the plant dies and we learn the Geyser Spell. Like Flare, it's a single target water spell. Now at this point you're supposed to talk to the unconscious fella, but I didn't realise this and I went wandering around the monastery for a little bit, eventually coming back and waking the man up. On the way back to seeing the passed out fella though, this happens. Yep, that's right, weapons in Koudelka can break, and as far as I know, this is pretty much random. We've managed to pick up a fair few weapons so far, but they're all different types and there's no shops in the game so that you can refill on basic weapons. So I made the executive decision that Edward is now just a punch man. Why use a weapon if you can use fist? This is actually a little bit of a running joke, as when given the option of using fists in a game, that's usually what I'll use. Even in the Souls games, I'll be fisting until the very end. We get back to the downed man who gives us a frosty reception. He introduces himself as James O'Flaherty, and he's searching the monastery for something. James is a devout Christian, and honestly, he brings a very fun dynamic to the team. He's also weirdly fixated with the plinth behind him, praying to God for strength. Realising that the group has the potential to help him, he simply decides to tag along. Awesome. Now that we've woken James, the fountain is working, and it's actually our first proper save point in the game. It also fully restores our HP and MP, which is pretty damn nice. James joins us at level 1, meaning he's decently behind the rest of the team, but hopefully we can catch him up pretty quickly. There's only one place left for us to check, but just the door that was warded by something, so we head over there. As we're crossing the corridor just before the room with the door we're looking for, James laments how dark and unsettling the monastery is. James also hates Lord Byron's poetry, something him and school-aged Chaz definitely share. Koudelka makes a Jesus joke, and again, the group dynamic is pretty excellent now with all the conflicting viewpoints.
If they have the power to do away with these evil spirits, I'd choose anyone. Even that dear old carpenter's son.
Blasphemous! Pagan! How heaven is...
It seems the caretakers are now trying to take us out with bullets since the poison didn't work. We've really come to the wrong place, haven't we? Checking the door, we get our second boss fight, and oh boy, I don't know if I did something wrong in this fight, but it took me a straight 20 minutes to kill these things. Either I didn't level up my magic enough, since they were taking nothing from either of my spellcasters, or this fight was just intended to last a long time. The green and blue enemies went down easy enough, but the red was seriously 15 minutes of this loop repeated. It even takes long enough that Koudelka's gun skill levels up twice and Edward's fist skill levels up once. It looks like levels just give you a chance to combo your attacks for more hits. It's not entirely a blessing on Koudelka, as each additional shot does still consume a bullet. Thankfully, the enemy magic attacks couldn't really damage anyone except Edward, who has an absolute truckload of health at this point, so with some light healing from James and some range support from Koudelka, all three do die eventually. Our ammo stocks are now very, very low though. Not good. We learn the Tornado spell from this fight, and also pick up a ring that gives Koudelka pretty much 50% increase to both intellect and mind. Very nice. We also give James a hammer on the off chance we actually get him in the melee mix. After that ridiculously long encounter, it's time to explore some more. We find a combination lockbox, but I have no idea what the code is. We'll have to make a note of that. Future chance here, we didn't find the code. The next room over gives us a cutscene. Sensing a mass of spirits in the room, Koudelka decides to let them take over a body to find out what they want. And this, doesn't really go to plan.
No! Don't touch me! You pisser! Go to hell!
After Koudelka's little meltdown, we go to check out the closet at the back of the room and, surprise, it's a literal monster closet. We're ambushed by the mummy and we get an, I suppose, boss fight? Edward doesn't really do much damage with his fists in this fight, so it's down to Koudelka with a flare to bring it down. It only takes 3 or so casts of flare for the mummy to go down, but I hope the game doesn't make a habit of just springing boss fights on you. We pick up the Megalith spell from this fight, the earth damage spell. Also, there's just a slightly annoying thing in that you have to interact with the closet after beating the boss to receive the rope ladder. It really should have just been a reward from the boss in my opinion. Oh well, on with the exploration. Spotting a girl up just ahead, Edward the Brave charges after her. Personally, I don't think I'd be able to trust anyone who was just chilling in this place, but Edward seems to know better. Right up until Koudelka stops him from walking off a sheer drop and the ghosts tell Edward that he should just die. Very cool, no worries at all. Thankfully, there's some hooks for us to attach the newly acquired rope ladder to. Very convenient, very welcome. Climbing down, we get into a random encounter with this weird skeleton disembodied arm. Again, enemy designs in this game are just excellent. We enter the nearest room available and get a message on the screen saying, "Something's not right." This is something that pops up pretty regularly throughout the game from now on, but this is obviously the first time I'd seen it in this playthrough. I wrongly assumed that it was trying to tell me that there was something to find in this room that was important. What it actually means, and has continued to mean up until the end of Disc 3 at least, is that there's a save point in the room, but to access it you have to beat a boss. Great. If this was a standard Let's Play, then the title of this part would be something like the episode where I accidentally fight 2 bosses in 15 minutes. But just before we get into the boss fight, there's a red glass piece on the floor to grab for something far later in the game. The next boss is actually interesting at least. It's a dark spirit version of our own party, and they do mostly what I've been doing with my party. Dark Koudelka will attack with magic, Dark Edward will be the melee chunky boy, and Dark James will also use magic. I believe he can heal, but he didn't do it during my fight. Edward even dies in this fight, and this actually highlighted why you can move around on the battlefield, because up until now it's felt kind of arbitrary. Think of your positioning as defining battle lines. You can only move forward up to the rank in front of the closest enemy, and you can't go any further than that. And the enemy is under the same rules. So now that Dark Edward is past real Edward's currently lifeless body, we can't actually revive Edward. If we kill the Dark version, we can. After a few rounds of pumping flares into Dark Edward, he goes down so we can stabilise real Edward and go wail on Dark James, who has been sitting in the corner and slinging spells the whole fight. It's good to know that my usual strategy of keeping casters still and in the back is a recognised strategy by the AI too. Koudelka continues to throw out flares, Edward keeps smacking, and James tries to keep everyone healthy, and eventually, the Dark Trio die. We get the revive spell from this encounter, but for the most part I'll be using whiskies to revive people, as revive is a costly spell and doesn't seem to heal as much as a whiskey does on revival. The save point for this room activates too, so we get a nice full restore on everyone. Perfect. There's another argument among the party about whether the caretakers are killing people or not. Koudelka lays down the law by telling Edward and James to shut their mouths if they want to live. Ever the diplomat. And while exploring, the floor gives way, and Edward sees someone or something that might have caused it. They're ending Disc 1. So we're at the bottom of a pit. And oh hey, a new enemy. He looks pretty cool. Wait, a gun? 245 damage. As far as I can tell, we have a new enemy pool to pull encounters from, and the difficulty has jumped up just a little bit. This thing managed to assassinate Koudelka before she got a single spell off. Another fun fact is that this enemy completely ignores the line of sight rules that we are forced to obey. In this configuration, if Koudelka wanted to shoot the enemy, she wouldn't be able to because Edward is blocking the shot. But no, the enemy just gets to shoot. We don't have to worry about this difficulty spike for too long though, as the way to get out of this room is just dumb. If you watch my Parasite Eve video, you may remember the zoo key, the key that sometimes just wasn't there and you had to go wander around and kill some time before it appeared. Well, this room has something similar from what I can tell. After about 15 minutes of walking around this tiny room and fighting 5 or 6 encounters, we can check the door and get a cutscene. But I'm really not sure what the trigger is for this, because I checked that door plenty of times while trying to figure out getting out. Is it time? Is it battles? The ghost of Charlotte appears to taunt us, calling us dead people. She died here hundreds of years ago apparently, beheaded at the age of 9. James tries to sympathise, but Charlotte is having none of it. Taking James's compassion as an insult, she sets a boss upon us. Well, I say boss, this guy's just a normal encounter that we can have. He does look cool though, like a ghost musketeer. After a few flares, he drops, and somehow so does the wall next to us. I'm not one to look a gift horse in the mouth though, and we go through. We find a mace and some knuckles in the room. Knuckles are interesting in that they're a weapon, but they use unarmed skill. I do put these on Edward, but naturally they break pretty quickly, so it's back to unarmed fist punching. In the next room, we see 2 corpses, and we obviously have to inspect those. We're told that they are the mummies Valna and Vigna, and there's a green key between them. However, as we try to snag the key, Valna says to give them back their dolls, and Vigna tells us to run while we still can. And then combat starts. Despite being told to run, I decide I'll give it a little try, but then everything we do to them results in a miss. So instead, it's definitely time to run. Running is just an option you have in the menu during combat if you press circle. Deciding to leave Valna and Vigna alone, we move on. Peep this enemy though. A corpse with its own severed arms stitched to it, and shards of glass protruding from its chest. Just brilliant. In a chamber with what appears to be a tree growing in a pit of acid, we find another save point guarding boss and decide to take a punt at it. And good lord, they've stepped up boss fights. This thing does look rad at least, but watch what he's about to do to Edward, who has about 750 max health currently. Oh, and he's fast, so he goes and hits Eddie with it again before we can get any healing off. So Edward drops, and the boss manages to silence James. The boss is also on the same rank as Edward, so we can't raise him. I'm sure the astute among you can tell where this fight is going. To add insult to injury, the boss actually gets 3 back-to-back attacks before Koudelka can do anything, and yep, we game over. So I decided to do just a touch of off-screen grinding, not a huge amount, just 3 or 4 levels to each party member, which should make things a little bit more manageable. With our freshly increased stats, we can now take on the evil priest properly. The usual tactic of Edward being the tank, Koudelka throwing flares, and James buffing our characters works very nicely, particularly since Koudelka now has access to the 2nd level of flare. Spells have 3 levels of power, with level 1 costing 8 MP, level 2 costing 16 MP, and level 3 costing a whopping 32 MP. Thankfully, Koudelka has a decent stack of MP to burn through. You can also notice the difference with the amount of damage Edward takes from the multi-hit barrage. Far more manageable now. It's still a lengthy fight as the priest has a large amount of HP to burn through, and his attacks can also induce silence on our characters. We have a decent amount of panacea to clear the status though. We eventually whittle down the priest and the save point in the room activates. Honestly, it's a pretty nice reward for beating the bosses if you ask me. Save points in Koudelka are fairly rare after all. Well, the actual save points are. The temporary save points are actually fairly plentiful. Towards the back of this area we find a room filled with loot, which is always a good time. James is over the moon at the find, talking about the value they'd have at the Vatican. Koudelka politely reminds James that these are probably all from the dead people that we've been finding along the way. Edward doesn't care about anything other than the monetary value of the find. I can respect that view. With the level of danger the gang is in, I'd want some sort of big reward at the end of it all as well. And once again, James won't let us blame the caretakers for all the deaths. He's a real stickler for those two, for whatever reason. We get a crossbow and some bolts and take none of the treasure with us. Take a look at the top left of the screen, by the way. Can you believe there's actually 2 doors there? We tried the obvious door, but it's locked and we need a red key to open it. And then I just turn around and leave to explore some more. Eventually I do find the other door though, so we can carry on. There's apparently a statue in this display, and to quote, if you poured water on it from above, you might be able to get it out. So let's keep that in mind as we carry on. Upstairs, we find a teddy with a letter in it, a lion statue, and a stone tablet. I've played enough survival horror to know that we'll probably collect a few other animal statues to probably put on some kind of device later on. In the next room, we're told, something's not right, so it's time for another boss fight. Say hello to the evil tree. I can almost see the tree if you flipped it upside down so the wiggly tentacles were its roots. We're far more prepared for this fight than the first time we came across the evil priest, so it's pretty easy to deal with. Eddie tanks, Koudelka flares, and James heals and buffs Koudelka's int. The evil tree does have access to group-wide magic, but Koudelka and James have a pretty high piety stat, so they don't really take any damage compared to Edward, who just gets struck by magic still. He's got a water health though, so it's just a case of keeping him alive to keep our backline alive. Koudelka's hitting for like 800 damage at this point, and the tree is less than 3000 health. But there it is again. Silence on his group magic. Honestly, this is where most of the difficulty that the game has comes from. The amount of high success rate ailments that the enemies tend to have. One fun side effect of Edward's low piety though, is that a single heal spell is healing him for over 1000 health, so he really just can't die at this point. And then the entire party gets silenced, because that's fun and fair. With the tree burned to ashes, the save point activates. Stepping into the next room, we get a nice CGI cutscene of Edward and James arguing, then a gunshot rings out from above, severing a rope holding a chandelier, causing it to fall and nearly kill them. An arm also falls out from the chandelier, and you better believe we're taking that with us. It seems it's a holy relic that once belonged to Daniel Scotius. From this room, there are 2 ways to go, so we decide to climb up to the nearest door before checking the stairs to see who that shot was from. The door actually takes us back to the start of the game, to the caretaker's quarters. Pretty handy since we didn't actually have a way back after our fall through the floor back at the end of Disc 1. But we don't need to do anything with that yet, so we'll go up the stairs in the chandelier room instead. At the top of them, we get some text saying that there's a man carrying a gun who attacks us, and we're at our next boss fight, Elias the Thief. This boss fight is incredibly frustrating, but I'm a big fan of it simply for the fact that it actually feels like it fits in with our situation. Every other boss fight so far has just been, surprise, here's some random thing to fight, but Elias has been established as a bit of a threat. Granted, he was only introduced about 30 seconds ago, but that's more than the evil priest or the evil tree. Anyway, let's talk about Elias and his friend Crate and Barrel. Because of the way movement works, being unable to pass to a rank that has an enemy on it, Elias is functionally immune while his friends Crate and Barrel are alive. I know what you're thinking though, Chaz, just use magic. And to that I say, I tried. But this guy has a ridiculous piety stat, so Koudelka just couldn't hit him with anything. She could hit Crate and Barrel though, which both go down in one spell each, and that frees up Edward to go and batter Elias. Elias, however, has some tricks of his own up his sleeve. Alright, fine, it's one trick, a gun, and his gun hurts a lot. Nearly 600 damage a turn amounts of a lot. But there's only one of him and 3 of us, and while he does get a couple of additional turns here and there, he can't outdamage James's healing, so although it's a pretty risky fight, we pull through and finally just beat a human to a pulp. We don't even kill him, we're that nice. Talking to him after the fight, he corroborates that it's the caretakers that are killing everyone in the monastery. James, ever the believer, blames Elias for the murders. Edward believes the thief, and then... guns him down in cold blood. Jesus, Eddie, he really wasn't that much of a threat. We have a quick route through his pockets for the red key, which means we have some looting to do. Going back to the earlier room with the double door that we missed, we get a music box and some nuts. The music box will be important later. There's also this diagram, which will help us with a puzzle. The puzzle is actually in the next room from Elias's cold, dead body, so let's shumph over there and figure it out. The puzzle is to find 2 sets of paths throughout the mansion and follow the red line. So we just trace a path through these symbols and the door opens. Nice and simple. We're in some kind of library now, and going into one of the rooms gets us the ochre glass pot. We're finding quite a few of these glass pots now. I wonder what they'll be used for. This enemy just looks kind of neat in my opinion, like some sort of human-shaped plant growth. I'd show more of the combat, but it's just a bit repetitive showing Koudelka slinging a spell while Edward punches things. There's also a locked box with Greek letters in it in this room, but the game won't even let us take a guess as to the solution. Heading down to the main hall of this area, we find a clock with a mural above it, but we can't interact with it yet despite it very clearly wanting us to climb up. Oh well, there is another door to check. Apparently, Koudelka's powers resonate with something in here, and we get a cutscene. There's a voice talking, but it's mostly undecipherable. Whatever we're being shown seems to be some kind of spell though. And finally, we're shown a woman, Elaine, and someone stood in front of a tree. The mural above the clock is shown opening now, but amusingly, it's not actually open. We need something else to open it up, despite the cutscene showing it open. Finally, Koudelka reveals that it was this Elaine person that summoned Koudelka to the monastery. It's seemingly hitting a little bit of a dead end. I did recall that there was another door that we know uses a red key. The room where we originally met Ogden and Bessie. As soon as we left, it was locked with a red key, so let me just use the magic of editing to cut out a load of backtracking it takes us to get there, and it's quite nice that the game auto-discards keys we no longer need. In the room we get a dragon statue, which is our second, and in the next room we get Valner's doll. Remember those 2 mummies we couldn't beat earlier? Yeah, they asked us to collect the dolls and give them back. So if we get Vigner's doll too, we might be able to get somewhere new. There's also a mask in here, and even though I've finished the game by the time I'm writing this, I couldn't figure out a use for it. Upon googling, it seems that the mask can allow some super rare drops from a single enemy later in the game. But I didn't get any, even with the mask. Oh well, it's just going to sit and take up a slot in our limited inventory, because of course there's a limited inventory, and that also includes your key items. Bleh. Checking the paintings in this room gives us another nice CGI cutscene where Koudelka notices that the ship in all of the paintings is called the Princess Alice. We're also shown dead bodies floating in the water. The Princess Alice was a pleasure boat that sunk in the Thames, and it seems like all the passengers died. With this area explored, we head all the way back to the printing press room where Koudelka had the vision of Elaine, and go through a door. Picking up the blue glass part while we're here, we check the door at the back of the room, which is what we've been collecting the statues for. But we've only found 2 of them so far, and I'd say we've been fairly thorough on picking things up. So where could the final statue be? Remember the wall we found earlier that said we might be able to get something out of it if water was poured on it from above? Well, that's apparently done now. I don't know for sure what the trigger is here. It's possibly the chandelier falling from when Elias attacked us. I know that we personally have done nothing to cause water to fall on that wall, but it's apparently happened, and the only major event that I can think of with even a remote chance of affecting this is the chandelier. Yet this just feels kind of insulting. The first time we checked it, it mentioned water, and the solution doesn't even have anything to do with water. So I spent a good while wandering around the monastery looking for the goat statue. But at least we have the 3rd statue now and can head back to the locked door. We get another Something's Not Right and a save point boss fight. Say hello to the Chimera. I mean, if nothing else, it does have the 3 different heads required. Really, we should have seen this coming because of the dragon, goat and lion statues. It seems I need to level Koudelka's mind stat a bit more, since her attacks just whiff constantly on this fight, so it's up to good old Edward to just punch the thing to death. The Chimera is another boss that silences with his magic attacks too. At this point, I'm really starting to feel how slow Koudelka's combat is. There's regularly a 5 or so second pause before a spell goes off, followed by another pause once it's resolved, and that goes for both your characters and any enemies that you happen to be fighting. The vast chunk of Koudelka's runtime is taken up with combat, and it really starts to grate at around the halfway mark for me personally. And let's just have a quick chat about the music. Koudelka doesn't have a lot of music, usually reserved for combat or cutscenes. While exploring the monastery, it's just silence with regards to the music, opting instead for ambience. This of course means that, for the most part, the only music you'll hear is the combat music, and there's only 2 tracks for that, a normal encounter and a boss encounter. Alright, fine, there's technically 2 more bits of combat music, but they're reserved for the last boss. Let's just say that the normal combat and normal boss music gets very old very quickly when it's the only music that you really hear. This is a long fight since it's only Edward who's capable of damaging the damn Chimera, but eventually it dies and we get access to a save point. James fawns over the selection of books in the library, but laments that there's one thing missing. Edward tries to pry and find out what James is actually here for, but he reveals nothing. The next puzzle, if you can call it that, had me stumped for a while. The printing press room has a wall that is apparently weak. Watch as I try to interact with the printing press at the bottom of the screen, because there is a press there, believe it or not. As you can see, nothing happens. So I went wandering for a while, wondering if I'd missed anything else. Turns out I hadn't, because when I eventually got back here, I could interact with the press and place the stone tablet, which causes the wall behind us to break. I'm not sure, maybe it was the vibrations from the press being used that shook the wall down. I'm trying to have a charitable view of this solution because this definitely pissed me off. I must have missed the interaction point by pixels and it cost me about 30 minutes of play. Behind the wall we find a library and a disc sitting on a box. Cool. Further along we also find a church nave with a relief piece just sitting in the middle of the floor. This is what we need to open the mural above the clock, by the way. Finally we find the stained glass window for us to put the coloured pieces we've been finding, and oh god, why do we only have 4 of them and not 5? Well, rather than go hunting for the last piece of the stained glass window, we instead go to use the relief piece to open the passageway above the clock. This section of the game definitely feels like they've just put puzzle solutions as far away as possible from the puzzles themselves in order to inflate the game's playtime by having you trek backwards and forwards. In order to emphasise the point, I'll just spoil that the last glass piece is behind the mural that we need the relief piece for, and the glass piece gives us a code for the Greek letter lockbox that we found way earlier on. I get that games shouldn't be straight lines, but personally, I think if the only reason you have me backtrack through an area several times is just to pick up an item that lets me get slightly further along in the complete opposite direction, then you could have probably designed things a little bit better. Sure, the game would be a damn sight shorter, but it's just not respectful of the player's time. I think the issue is compounded by the random encounters. As explained, combat in Koudelka feels slow, and if you're getting 5 encounters as you traverse the area, then the same amount on the way back, things start to take a long time. If you've been watching the channel, then you'll know that one of the things that I really respect from a game is when they respect the player's time, and honestly, the back half of Koudelka just does not do that. Anyway, we get up to the mural and insert the relief piece, and the door opens. We climb in and the music box activates, playing a little tune. Stepping on the 4 panels on the floor in the right order plays the same tune and opens the door to go further. In the next room, we get a CGI cutscene with a coffin. The coffin starts to open, and we're introduced to the best character in the game, Roger Bacon. He awakens and says a few things, ending with emigre.
Cross your fingers.
That was disappointing.
Holy Savior! The secret of the Fomors from the bottom of the sea. Emigre!
And then collapses again. Don't worry, we'll be seeing him a few more times before the end of the game. It seems James also knows about the emigre document. Upon further pressing, James reveals that he's been sent here by the Vatican to recover the emigre document after it was stolen. A fella called Patrick Hayworth paid a very high amount of money for the document from whoever stole it. It seems the druidic secrets for eternal life and raising the dead are contained in the emigre document, and that Patrick Hayworth was actually a close friend of James. Patrick lives in a building next to the monastery, so you can bet that we'll be going there before long. Also in the room is the green glass part, as I mentioned earlier. We hippity-hoppity over to the church to pop the last piece into place, and are granted a flash of the Greek lockbox to remind us that it exists. So we go all the way back to that room to get whatever is in there. It's letters from Sophia Delotta to her daughter, Charlotte. Yes, that Charlotte, the ghost that we've seen hanging around the monastery. Finally, we head all the way back to the hidden church to the door that was also opened when we fixed the window. At the back of the church, we can see a weirdly glowing section, so let's go and take a look at that. Looking through the hall, we get glimpses of some weird thorny vines undulating inside, smashing against the walls, which is, you know, very odd. Looks like we might have to go a different way, so we head towards the exit of the church instead. Unfortunately, it seems that today is All Saints' Day and something starts to appear in front of the group. Coalescing into being, Koudelka is thrown by the gargoyle that has appeared. James and Edward make a run for it, leaving Koudelka stuck in the church on her own. We simply can't beat this enemy. It's actually the game's super boss. So we run. We head down the stairs outside the church, and Disc 2 ends. At any point now, we can head back into the church to fight the gargoyle, super boss of the game. However, I have no interest in fighting it. It would require a silly amount of grinding, and most of the guides that exist recommend using the gargoyle killer weapon for the massive advantage it provides. How do we get that? Well, Koudelka has an incredibly esoteric way of rewarding some things. You have to make saves at specific times in the game and have a specific amount of things in your inventory. The times are as follows: 1 hour, 11 minutes, 11 seconds. 2 hour, 22 minutes and 22 seconds. 3 hours, 33 minutes and 33 seconds. 4 hours, 44 minutes and 44 seconds. 5 hours, 55 minutes and 55 seconds. 10 hours, 10 minutes and 10 seconds. 11 hours, 11 minutes and 11 seconds. 22 hours, 22 minutes and 22 seconds. If you make a save at exactly one of those times and have in total 10, 21, 32 or 43 items in your inventory, you'll get a special reward. These range from accessories to weapons, but if you save at 11, 11, 11, you'll get the Gargoyle Killer. My save time at the last save point before fighting the final boss was around 8 hours and 20 minutes. So in order to have a chance of beating the Gargoyle, I'd need to wait for almost 3 hours, and I'm just not doing that, so the Gargoyle remains alive on my save file. I'm fine with this because you don't need to kill it for any of the 3 available endings. Yes, we get all 3 in this playthrough, so it's as close to 100% run as it can be without waiting for arbitrary save times. Anyway, we're now outside and can wander around a bit finding statues that we can put the icon pieces we've been finding throughout the game on. We do have to fight a few things with just Koudelka, but most things just melt to a flare spell before they can even hit us once. Now I want you to look closely at this screen here. Ignoring the bottle on the right, can you see anything that looks like an item you can pick up? No? Well, you're wrong, because the pendant is actually on this screen, on the fountain, right in the middle. And if you miss the pendant, then you can't fight the final boss at all. You'll get a gimmick ending straight into a game over, and if you made your last save after the point of no return, then haha, screw you, I guess. I really don't understand why this is a thing that exists. Yes, we see Koudelka lose her pendant in the intro cutscene, but she's made absolutely zero mention of it since, so there's a decent chance you'll have forgotten all about it. And even if you hadn't, there's absolutely no indication that it's here. Arbitrarily locking your players out of finishing the game because they didn't pick something up hours before the ending is something that should have died with the King's Quest series. Now that we have the pendant though, and have set all of the icon's effects on each of the statues, the waterfall in the middle of the area has stopped flowing and we can access the door below it. A nice juicy guillotine greets us. I do like the framing of this room. It shows very, very well that there's some things in this monastery that are just completely screwed up. Behind the guillotine is a ladder, and you better believe we're climbing down that. It seems we've found where the caretakers have been killing people, and we can prove it as Ogden sneaks up behind Koudelka and bonks her on the head, knocking her out. We awaken to Ogden sharpening his axe and talking a lot of smack to Koudelka, mentioning that if Elaine was saved, then this mess would have never happened. Ogden goes to strike us with the axe, but Bessie shoots him with a goddamn shotgun before she turns it on herself. But not before she explains that Ogden was the captain of the Princess Alice, the pleasure boat we found out about earlier. So we steal the shotgun, and then rummage around Bessie's body and get a blue key. Back down the ladder we go to the killing room. At the back of the room, we can pick up a bottle of blood. And on the other side of the room, we have a brief rendezvous with Edward and James. James figures there has to be another way out. The group agrees to regroup in the library. A bit of exploring gets us to another save point boss. We still only have Koudelka, but this guy thankfully takes a decent amount of damage from magic. I really like how his inner arms do a little punch animation as he walks. His physical attacks can hurt, but he mostly chooses to do some purely magical attacks, and it was actually a very easy fight. In the next room, we see a statue of a woman in the wall, and interacting with it, it seems that if we pour blood on it, it'll fall. So using the bottle of blood that we got in the previous room, we use it, and sure enough, we can go through the wall after the statue falls. Inside the room, we meet a monster. I won't say it's a friendly monster, but it won't attack us and we can talk to it for hints for future puzzles or for a little bit of lore about what's going on. However, you have to exit and enter the room each time to get it to say something new. I think the most important thing story-wise is probably that Patrick hired this thing to work here. I don't know what this thing is doing to earn a living wage, but it can't be particularly strenuous work given that it doesn't have any limbs. In fact, it's just an upside-down, disembodied head from what I can tell. Further along the corridor, we find ourselves in a graveyard. Charlotte is buried here, so we give her a quick prayer and keep looking around. There's a grave on its own with Vigner's doll next to it, and the grave actually belongs to Daniel Scotius himself. As we pray, Roger Bacon shows up. Roger used to be the foremost warlock, but currently doesn't know what he is. He's also been asleep for 100 years. What a character.
But I will not die.
He unlocks a gate we can use to get back up to the main section of the monastery, reuniting with our boys Edward and James in the printing press room. We get more backstory. It seems that James and Patrick were originally rivals in love for Elaine. He joined the church after being rejected by Elaine for Patrick. Koudelka thinks there's a bigger secret to uncover here in the monastery. With both the Valna and Vigna dolls in our possession, we can go all the way back to the start of Disc 2 and try to take the green key once again. This time we're given the option of handing the dolls over, which we choose to do. We get the green key, and upon opening the door next to them, we immediately toss the key away. I don't know how Koudelka knows she won't need it anymore, but hey, it's a freed up inventory slot if nothing else. We're now in Charlotte's cell, which is the other side of the cell we were in at the start of Disc 2. We go up some stairs and through a door and get into a pleasant looking room where, upon trying to look around, the furniture in the room comes to life and attacks us. Yes, we have a boss fight against a bookshelf and some chairs. Amazing. It only lasts a couple of rounds since Koudelka has a 3rd level flare now and hits ridiculously hard on these enemies. Here's where things get a little bit interesting though. Remember the stack of letters we got from the Greek lockbox? If we didn't have those, we'd actually fight Charlotte now. But I think it feels better from a story perspective to have those letters and get this cutscene instead. Koudelka gives Charlotte the letters, and Charlotte finally finds peace, moving on to the afterlife. Moving past a mass of bodies, we use the blue key and enter Patrick's quarters. Climbing up a series of ledges lets us enter this room, which lets us interact with a statue head for some reason. I genuinely don't know what this does. It might have unlocked the secret library in this room? I'm not sure. Heading into the downstairs room, we see a gramophone and we put the disc we found earlier in it. We get Patrick's research notes, and I made the stupid decision to read them while this repetitive tune plays. I'll summarise since there's a lot of reading to be done. Patrick acquired the Emigre file in order to resurrect Elaine. Elaine was killed during a robbery while Patrick was away. The Druidic rituals contained in the Emigre file mentioned that resentful spirits are the driving force behind the ritual. Patrick, Ogden and Bessie start kidnapping people to feed Patrick's cauldron in order to power the ritual of resurrection. Eventually, deciding that kidnapping isn't offering enough souls, they start to barter with slavers for even more people to sacrifice. After feeding many souls to the cauldron, the resurrection appears to work, except Elaine has been brought back without a human soul. Despite Patrick following the Emigre file to the letter, he only succeeded in creating a monster. In the next room over, we get another save point boss, and I'm really starting to tire of save point bosses now. They just don't fit in with the story or anything. What even is this thing? It's also another fight with a ranged silencer, that's super cool and not at all annoying. The same punch flare heal combo takes it out after about 10 minutes of back and forth. In this hall, we find a painting of Elaine, and Koudelka channels her spirit. Her and James have a little catch up, and she thanks Koudelka for responding to her cries for help. We get a brief summary of what happened to Elaine, and she asks us to turn her body to ashes. James also has a bit of a breakdown, wondering what he's been doing with his life, and hoo boy, I feel that. I'm actually a big fan of the voice acting on display here. You can really feel James's pain.
I have no meaning in my life. Damn it! What have I been doing with my life? Elaine! Elaine!
With that out of the way, we can enter the final room that until now has been blocked by a mysterious force. Checking the shelves gives us a code without any kind of puzzle to solve. We also find a memo on the table telling us that Patrick weighed more or less 70 pounds. To put that into perspective, according to Google, the average 25-year-old American male currently weighs near 200 pounds, so Patrick is seriously unhealthy. Using a scale in the same room, we find that Koudelka weighs 45 pounds. Amusingly, this means that Koudelka weighs about as much as an adult elephant's heart. Don't know why I had to share that, I just think it's fun. Going down the fireplace, we find a scale. It needs to be set so the counterweight plus Koudelka matches Patrick's weight. So we set the counterweight at 25 and the door opens. Koudelka refuses to progress further until she knows how to dispose of Elaine's body, so it's back to the first room we found to interact with a wall to enter the secret library. And inside of the library we meet our good friend, Roger Bacon. We find out that Edward is 20 years old, and that's a rough 20 years. I love the trend that Japanese games have, where the older characters are, like, barely adults. Roger proves to James that he's the original Roger Bacon. He talks a bit more about the Migra documents, revealing that he actually used them himself in order to give himself immortality. Well, that explains how he's like 600 years old at least. He asks to be left alone to study in the library for a while, but we have information we need, so we go straight back in. We give him the research journals we found, and he agrees that the events in the journals did take place. We need a remnant of Daniel Scotius to throw into the cauldron to destroy the Tree of Life. So it's pretty handy that we found his arm earlier, isn't it? Safe in the knowledge that we can stop this, Koudelka finally agrees with leaving, and we end up in another church. At the back of this church is another save point boss fight, the last of the game. Say hello to the Fallen Angel, or Buddha. And this fight is bad. You see, at times the Fallen Angel is going to start freaking out, shaking violently, and if we hit it with magic while it's shaking like that, then it'll be healed rather than take damage. But casting magic in this game isn't instant. There's a delay between starting the cast and it actually going off. So there's multiple times during this fight where it's not shaken and I go to cast with Koudelka only for it to get in a turn while waiting for the cast to go off and shifting to its shaken form. He can also slap Edward for over 1,000 damage, so healing needs to be put out pretty often. While it's nice to have a fight that can't just be spammed through, I don't think this is the way that it should have been done. It just feels like sometimes you're arbitrarily going to heal the boss and that's that. Now let's talk about how nonsense the progression's going to be towards the end of the game. We picked up an empty bottle while exploring Patrick's study. That bottle can be used to get some acid from the tank we found in the underground at the start of Disc 2 next to the tree. But either I messed up some triggers, or the game chooses not to remind you of this until the scenes after you already have it. So we start by hotfooting it all the way back to the acid vat. With the acid in hand, we can go all the way back to the room we just fought the Fallen Angel in and try to open the door just outside. We then get a scene where James explains that he can make some nitroglycerin to bolt the door open. He also tries to convince Koudelka and Edward to leave, since it's James's friend who started all of this. Disc 3 now ends, and we're into the end game. We go back up to Patrick's lab, and while James works to make nitroglycerin, Koudelka and Edward do the only reasonable thing and get absolutely trolleyed and talk about their upbringings. There's some sentimental nonsense here, but I don't really want to show too much of it, as there's a couple of problematic slurs thrown around towards the Romani people. Eventually, Edward probes too far, and Koudelka shouts at him. This scene also lasts for a full 10 minutes. Good lord, the voice acting is nice and everything, but even the endings aren't this long. With the nitroglycerin made, we go back to the door and get a cutscene of Edward shooting the vial and blowing the door up. Seems we've found that Tree of Life thing. There's roots everywhere. Heading up some stairs, we find the organ that the friendly monster we found earlier had mentioned. We have to press the keys in the correct order, and one of the notes we found earlier has the order, which is secret pain people light. This causes the platform in the centre of the room to move, allowing us to head deeper. We find a desiccated Patrick who has apparently become the nutrients to sustain the Tree of Life. James makes one last attempt to get the others to let him solve things alone, dousing the area in paraffin. Koudelka and Edward refuse. James throws the arm into the well and the roots come to life. Throwing a lantern into the church, it ignites and the roots start to burn. We now have to climb the tower in order to face the final boss. There's some rough fights on the way up, but I just want to highlight one. The roots with the skeleton in it, which I'm realising now are probably the roots that Patrick is wrapped up in. It's virtually immune to magic, and it does a lot of physical damage, even to Edward. It manages to kill Edward and move past him, so we can't raise him either. I tried to give Koudelka a few different melee weapons, but she doesn't have the stats to do any damage, so we're just soft-locked here. We can either let our characters die, or we can just restart the game. So I restarted, and I trekked back up from the save point, and the next time I fought the damn thing, my spells decided they could hit. Very strange. Reaching the top of the tower, I quickly discard the pendant that we found earlier. Stepping in, we get a message about feeling uneasy due to not having the pendant. This is the only sign the game gives you, other than the friendly monster from earlier asking where a pendant is, that it's actually an important item, and we're about to see why. I'll just let this play out. But do remember you can get this far without ever finding the pendant, and you can save so that you can never find the pendant. Yeah, if you've managed to get this far and don't have the pendant, then everyone dies. Game over. Also, you can't get back to it now, so tee-hee, game over. This is just fucking rude and horrible. A true dick move from the game. But anyway, we trudge back up to the top of the tower and keep the pendant this time. Let's see what goes differently. So Elaine's blast doesn't kill us and we start to run away, but she catches up and hot damn, this track actually kind of slaps. I take the same approach for these next 2 of 3 fights. I keep everyone in a line next to each other away from Elaine because that'll force her to use magical attacks, and we can deal with those better than hard-hitting physical attacks. I also completely forgot I could change Edward to some kind of ranged weapon, because they scale with strength, so he could help with this fight. But the old classic of Flare with Koudelka eventually brings down Elaine's first form. We run away some more and she catches up again, and I'll be honest, at this point I was convinced I'd screwed up because she's really no different in the second fight. Well, there's one difference I suppose. Flare heals her now, so we use Geyser instead. The group magic in both phases poisons, by the way, so James is just healing every single round. We give Edward the crossbow in the hopes that he can contribute to the damage in some form, and hot damn, that thing trucks. After taking this form down, we can run to the top of the tower. She transforms into a spider/fly looking thing and the final battle begins. This fight took, no word of a lie, 30 minutes. I could have done a fair chunk of grinding to speed it up, but at this point Edward's physical stats are in the 60s, as are Koudelka's magic stats, and I thought that was enough before starting to feel some diminishing returns with regards to battles fought to stats gained. Edward is doing an average of 1200 damage per crossbow shot. Koudelka is doing around about 1000. The boss has 17,000 HP. Pretty easy, yeah? No, not at all. Because one of the things this boss can do is heal itself for about 5,500 health. It also hits like a freight train. Group magic's doing 3,000 to Edward and around 1,500 to our magic peeps, so there's a lot of healing going out in this fight too. In fact, we use a lot of our Roman nuts to revive our downed characters. There was just no reason to let the boss heal that much that often. I think it healed 5 times during our fight with it, each time setting us back a long way from killing it. It really doesn't help that each time Edward shoots the crossbow, he needs to use his next turn to reload the thing either. Things get really scary towards the end of the fight when Elaine decides to visit us in melee, and this happens. Like, holy hell, that's just not okay. There's no way that Koudelka could have survived that. The stars align in the most wonderful way though. As the boss curls up to heal again, Edward loads the final crossbow bolt, lines up the shot, fires, and... that's it. We've beat her. I can't think of a more ridiculous ending for this fight. I've burned through about 30 crossbow bolts just on this form. Elaine falls apart. Crashing into the monastery, causing one last explosion. Roger Bacon decides to stay awake after everything he's seen. Koudelka says that the dead don't speak, they're only memories. James looks outwards to the sea. Cut to credits. This is actually classed as a good ending. I don't know why. It's incredibly unsatisfying. But we still have one more ending to go. So let's get to it. To get the final ending, we simply have to lose the final battle with Elaine. Upon the total party wipe, James sacrifices himself to stop Elaine, and both of them are vaporized and taken to heaven. Koudelka and Edward spend the night together before going their separate ways in the morning. Roger asks Koudelka if she's alright not following Edward, to which she says that she has a funny feeling that one way or another she'll see him again, and we cut to credits. While this ending is more bittersweet, I think it's a far more interesting ending. James, feeling that his quest is at an end, sacrifices everything for the woman that he loves. Koudelka has been a rough game. The back half just feels unnecessarily long and punishing with all of the backtracking through the manor and the slow combat system. But credit where credit's due, it tried to do something different. With its higher emphasis on production value to tell a story, I can understand that the gameplay fell by the wayside a little bit in order to tell the tale it wanted to tell. And the story that is there is good. It's interesting, the characters we adventure with are all well written and play off each other very well. It's simply a few niggles in the gameplay that mark the experience for me. It's an interesting companion piece to the first Parasite Eve, in my opinion. Two different directions on marrying survival horror and JRPGs. Neither one managed to get things perfect, but it's important that they tried. Every game under the sun has some kind of leveling system to tie in an RPG experience these days, but back in 1999 it was fairly rare to have an RPG with such a different setting and feeling. There's a lot to love about Koudelka, and there's a lot to hate. Personally, I think the good outweighs the bad, and if nothing else, it's an experience that isn't really like anything else on the platform. What about you? Have you played Koudelka? How about Shadow Hearts, the spiritual sequel? What did you think? I've been your Uncle Chaz, and I'll see you in the next one.